February 20th, 1944. Rath Debden, England. The dawn sky is bitter cold, streaked with the tracks of B-17s bound for Germany. On the flight line, mechanics stamp their boots, wreathed in clouds of steam and exhaust. Among the line of silver P-51 Mustangs, one aircraft stands out for its battered paint and the nerveless confidence of its pilot, a machine with a secret buried deep inside. Chief Mechanic Gus Kennedy wipes frozen fingers on his overalls, squinting into the swirling mist. The Mustang Lucky Lady is scheduled for the day's highest escort, over Berlin, 30,000 feet up, where the air turns thin and engines die of heat before enemies ever get close. Gus inspects her belly scoop, eyes narrowed at the radiator, mind racing beyond the checklist. Across the dispersal, a junior engineer whispers, "They say Gus did something unapproved last week. Lucky Lady came back when 3 others dropped out." Gus isn't famous among the pilots. He's a loner, a problem solver, a skeptic when it comes to factory settings. As the pilots prepare their gear, Gus rolls out a battered schematic, sketches a change so subtle it would be unnoticed by any inspector, but crucial at the edge of endurance. In the command trailer, ground crews debate coolant ratios and official doctrine. The veterans know altitude kills Mustangs as reliably as flak in fighters. At the last briefing, a squadron lost 2 planes to overheating in the climb. The regulations, thick and cautious, don't save machines in the freezing thin air. Kennedy mutters to his team, "Sometimes you have to fix what you're told is already perfect." He tightens a small, handmade adjustable plate at the cooling scoop's exit, a tweak to airflow and pressure. It's not in any manual, not even in the charts drawn up by North American Aviation or the Harrison radiator experts. But here, in the black cold, it's the only thing standing between might and catastrophe. As Lucky Lady taxis out, her engine note is smoother, Merlin's temperature gauge steady. Gus looks on, not for glory, but for survival. "All I ever wanted was a fighter that didn't quit at altitude. I don't care what the paperwork says." Gus Kennedy, 334th Fighter Squadron. The fog lifts enough to reveal rows of Mustangs shimmering in morning frost. Pilots climb aboard with hope and dread. Cut to black. In the distance, one mechanic's silence marks the line between disaster and invincibility. The crisis had been simmering for months on every Allied airfield in England. On paper, the P-51 Mustang was billed as the ultimate escort. Fast, agile, long-legged, powered by the legendary Merlin engine, and protected by a cooling system as innovative as its wing design. Yet in the brutal reality of high-altitude warfare, the Mustang's cutting-edge radiator and scoop, that elegant belly pod that was supposed to turn lost heat into thrust, proved both miracle and menace. Pilots returning from Berlin or Brunswick would stumble from their cockpits, faces gray and gaunt, muttering about temperature spikes and sudden drops in engine revs. The chief engineer's logs told the story in hard numbers. Over a dozen mission aborts in January alone due to overheating. Replacement Merlins arrived weekly. Ground crews worked unending shifts, some sleeping in hangars beside the birds, too afraid to lose a minute if another coolant line ruptured in the frost. For Gus Kennedy, whose blood pressure matched the radiators on most days, the crisis was personal. Each Mustang came with a spiral-bound manual thicker than a Bible, warning of coolant temperatures, airflow calibration, outlet nozzle configurations, oil temperature limits, and the dangers of pushing a red line at altitude. The Merlin might have been an icon, but in the wrong hands, it was a ticking bomb. The Mustang's radiator was meant to do more than cool. Inspired by a British engineer named F.W. Meredith, the scoop design was a marvel of World War II thermodynamics. At low speeds and takeoff, the scoop was wide open, gaping toward the icy slipstream. As airspeed increased, a clever baffle directed chilled air through a series of tubes set perilously close to the engine's fiery heart. As hot coolant flowed from the engine block, it traversed the radiator fins, dumping its heat, while the air, now superheated, passed through an exit nozzle that recaptured a fraction of that waste heat, transforming it into forward thrust. On good days, the Meredith effect offset almost all the aerodynamic drag lost to cooling. On bad days, climbing through ice clouds at 29,000 feet, it meant pilots were running so close to the edge that a temperature spike might send the Merlin spewing steam or frosting every gauge on the panel. Too much airflow, and the system lost pressure, dropping coolant below boiling. Too little, and the engine choked, valves warping, bearings squealing as the world outside froze. "You've got a question of balance," Gus would mutter, lunging over a battered service stand, tracing finger over blueprints littered with coffee stains and fingerprints. "Too much drag, you're a sitting duck. Too little cooling, you're a funeral." The mechanic's lounge, really just a half-warmed tent with a single iron stove, became the confessional for Mustang grievances. Lou Spitzer, a former Hudson mechanic, voiced what everyone felt. "We can't keep pulling these engines apart, Gus. HQ says throttle back, baby the birds at 28,000. But Jerry's not throttling back. Bombers are depending on us." On nights when the snow piled past the windows, Gus pored over reports, collating field failures, burst hoses, coolant leaks, unexplained engine fires. They started keeping track of Merlin funerals, downed Mustangs whose engines died far from any enemy. The command post would issue statements, operating within design parameters. But the truth echoed in the echo-filled hangar, where one climb away from disaster every single sortie. The pilots, flying with death for a wingman, developed habits of superstition. Some tapped the temperature gauge before takeoff. Others clipped good luck charms to their cooling levers. Invariably, every crew chief adapted at least one unapproved procedure for survival, though most would never admit it. For Gus, the tipping point came after a catastrophic mission in early February. 3 Mustangs, all newly rebuilt, flamed out before they reached altitude. Bomber crews watched hopeless as their escorts peeled away, hatches venting white smoke, forced to glide for miles before crash landing on grimy English fields well short of home. The pilots, shaken, gathered around a battered heater in the debriefing room. Captain Pete "Crowbar" MacArthur stared at his drained coffee. "We aren't losing to flak or Focke-Wulf's, Kennedy. We're losing to the freezing sky." His eyes lingered on Gus's grease-stained hands. "If there's something you're not telling us, I'd rather a warning now." That night, Kennedy contemplated his options. The regulations offered nothing new. Factory bulletins warned him against tampering. Every critical change had to be approved in triplicate, all modifications subject to command sign-off and, most importantly, paperwork. It was, in essence, a bureaucrat's war as much as a pilot's. But Kennedy also knew what the manuals didn't say, that the Mustang's real advantage was not only in the engine, but what a smart pair of hands could do to cool her in the clouds. He dug out a battered notebook, scrawling ideas in the margins. Venturi insert for higher altitude, removable baffle for scoop, insulate radiator face. Simple hacks, none tested in the wind tunnels at Inglewood or Birmingham, but each born out of necessity. By morning, Gus had built a baffle of thin steel, shaped not by the rulebook but by trial and error. He fit it to Lucky Lady at the scoop's exit. With a twist of ingenuity, he left a gap just wide enough for runaway pressure, that delicate balance between thrust and salvation. To his assistants, he explained it quietly. "If it goes wrong, we might blow coolant out the back. But if it goes right, we beat the sky at its own game." As the first rays of sunlight lit the edge of the hangar, Gus looked up at the flight line where rows of Mustangs, gear frosted, waited for a chance to fight another day. In the shadowy space between regulation and rescue, the next chapter of survival was about to begin. The hangar was quiet before first light, broken only by the scrape of wrenches and the low hum of a portable heater. For Gus Kennedy, the hours just before a sortie held a tension thicker than the oil coating the Mustang's Merlin. Fingers numb, he reviewed his modifications. Just a scratch-built steel baffle, fitted by instinct more than calculation, cinched into the exit duct below the belly scoop of Lucky Lady. "No charts for this one," he muttered, head ducked, as if the floor chief or a brass-hatted inspector might appear from behind a toolbox. His confidence was measured not in degrees or pounds of thrust, but in lives. Each tweak and rivet carried the double weight of hope and guilt. If his baffle failed, if he had misjudged the pressure, or the gap, or the shape, it could mean scalded pilots and engine fires over enemy country. He ran his hands one final time along the scoop. Inside, the Mustang seemed to shiver in anticipation. The ventral duct, modeled on the Meredith effect, was meant to cheat physics, turning heat into thrust. But what Kennedy had changed was a matter of survival, not speed. A variable airflow restriction for high altitude, home-built, and utterly unapproved. By now, Kennedy had built a silent reputation. Rumors crossed the field. He's the only one whose planes come home with the gauges still in the green. Pilots from other squadrons paid him quiet visits, sometimes bringing extra rations, sometimes only questions. On this morning, no one had to ask. Captain Pete Crowbar MacArthur watched as Kennedy finished the latest adjustment. "You'll be the first to hear if it kills me," he quipped, only half joking. Kennedy's reply was grim. "She'll hold. Just use the lever the way we talked. At 30,000, crank the scoop plug in one notch. Let the temp climb, but not above the yellow." Crowbar grinned, famous for daring overconfidence, but trusting now in a mechanic's desperate gamble. "If it works, I'll owe you a bottle. If not, I won't be around to complain." The flight briefing was a rehearsed routine of objectives and threats. The target, Leipzig. The forecast, clear skies, severe cold, rising winds at high altitude. But beneath the routine, everyone was thinking about the last botched escort, when 3 Mustangs went down before even meeting the enemy. Morning broke with bone-crunching cold. Engines coughed and roared, condensed breath curling from exhaust stacks as ground crews scrambled between prop blades and ladders. Lucky Lady waited, silver skin glowing. Gus checked on the rest of the squadron, then hovered beside Crowbar's machine, a guardian with more on the line than most would ever know. Startup was a drill, prime, throttle, 6 quick mags, and the Merlin shrieked to life. Kennedy's eyes always flicked to the coolant gauge first, a slight bounce, then a steady climb. Not normal, not by the book, yet strangely reassuring. Taxi out, join up, and line abreast down the perimeter track. Over the radio, the tower called, "Escort ready. Good luck, 334th. Takeoff was uneventful. Wheels up, climb for altitude, wings tipping in weak sunlight. Gus watched from the ground, unable to shed the sick tension. 3 hours later, the airfield echoed with news. One by one, the Mustangs returned. Some belly-landed, shot up, others trailed vapor and wore new scars. But Lucky Lady came home not only intact, but with engine temperatures dead steady, even in the deathly climb. Debriefing was pure electricity. Crowbar was exuberant, eyes lit with both triumph and disbelief. "We crossed 30,000 feet and the coolant gauge barely wobbled," he reported, voice hoarse from oxygen mask and strain. "Never seen anything like it. Used your plug at the mark. Engine was better than on the ground." Kennedy, stone-faced, allowed himself a rare smile. "It wasn't in the manual, but it kept you alive." The word spread. That week, 2 more crews requested the modification in hushed tones. The shop was never empty. Kennedy and his team were careful, never documenting, always erasing traces before inspections. But the results could not be hidden. 3 successive high-altitude missions returned with every plane. Technical logs discreetly notated, modified flow restrictor applied to duct. Engine failures dropped by 70% on these sorties. The pilots, once cynical, now bantered about Lucky Gus's trick as a shield against bad fortune. The field chief eventually confronted Kennedy, paperwork in hand. "Regulations say these systems are not to be altered. That's a court-martial, Gus." Kennedy didn't blink. "Regulations say, don't lose engines either. Pick one." It was the kind of logic war demanded, defiance forged in hope, tested by fire. Within weeks, his modification, sometimes improved, sometimes barely copied, could be found on dozens of Mustangs up and down the front, from Debden to Bodney. Each time a plane came home, the story gained weight, until even the official engineers closed one eye, letting results speak louder than orders. For Kennedy, there was no time to bask in achievement. Another sunrise always brought another sortie. Each night, he lay sleepless, haunted by ghosts of lost friends and the knowledge that every hack must eventually be paid for, in glory or disaster. The crisis had found its maverick, and the P-51 Mustang had found its path to invincibility. But the real test, the one against both the enemy and suspicion, had only just begun. If war was a battle between innovation and bureaucracy, Gus Kennedy was on the front line, armed not with patents, but with pliers and a stubborn refusal to watch any more funerals caused by technical failure. As Lucky Lady's success was quietly witnessed by pilots and mechanics alike, Kennedy's unapproved baffle modification was soon an open secret, spreading through the squadron and within days to neighboring airfields. Official resistance was immediate. The head maintenance inspector, Captain Whitmore, summoned Kennedy to the drafty office above the engine shop, voice trembling with both outrage and worry. You understand what's at stake? Your job, your flight status, the safety of every man in the air. These field modifications are not authorized, Kennedy. Gus stood his ground, exhaustion bringing clarity. Sir, I understand what's at stake every time a plane doesn't come home because a gauge exceeded regulation. You want a report? Count the men alive. Word spread through informal channels. A whispered request here, a blueprinted sketch left in a mess hall, conflicting with memos sent from North American Aviation that insisted only standardized parts and configurations were to be used. A technical officer tried to confiscate Kennedy's baffle, but the pilots argued him down. Many now owed their survival to the crazy scoop trick. By the end of March, more than half of the squadron's Mustangs had the mod installed, sometimes by Kennedy himself, sometimes by enterprising ground crew using homemade variants, steel shims, copper plate, or even cut sections of fuel tank. The technical challenge was real. Every tweak had to balance airflow, radiator pressure, thrust recovery, and avoid excess drag. Kennedy responded by keeping meticulous notes and, more importantly, by sharing what worked and what didn't. The shop became a laboratory and, in a way, a school. Squadron pilots compiled their own data. On 3 sorties above 29,000 feet, engine failures dropped by 80% compared to February. Temperature gauge redline incidents vanished. Statistical reports, buried in daily logs, showed the cooling hack not only kept Merlins running at altitude, it improved fuel efficiency and slightly increased range by maximizing the Meredith effect's thrust recovery. Pilots took notice. Lieutenant Ennis Rid-Eye Graves, a skeptic at first, became one of Kennedy's biggest advocates. After surviving 2 missions that broke the previous engine failure record, he approached Kennedy with a simple request. Whatever you did, do it to all our birds. I'll sign any paper they shove at me. Morale, battered all winter, began to recover. Pilots were less stricken by the prospect of altitude. Ground crews felt a new nervous pride, a sense that, finally, their work could trump doctrine. Kennedy became a fixture, fielding queries from British Mustang squadrons, Canadian units, and technical visits by engineers who wanted to understand the field solution that outpaced the lab. Even skeptical officers relented. Captain Whitmore, having first threatened Kennedy, later confided in him. You're the kind of headache that wins wars, Gus. Don't expect any medals, just keep them flying. Data spread. Maintenance bulletins began referencing field-modified duct restrictors, without naming names. Engineers grew less interested in reprimanding, more intent on learning. In the air, Lucky Lady and her sisters achieved what the manuals had said was nearly impossible: sustained escort at maximum altitude, across Berlin and beyond. The rest of the group noticed, as did command. Unofficially, rumors of the baffle mod reached North American Aviation. As the Allies advanced over Europe and victories piled up, the P-51's reputation as an invincible high-altitude fighter was cemented everywhere, in part because one mechanic refused to accept the limitations written on a sheet of paper. Kennedy's team became the silent architects of that legacy. Every sunrise brought another mission, another chance to see if innovation would triumph over bureaucracy. One rivet, one duct, one field fix at a time. And in the cool silence after a successful sortie, pilots gathered around Kennedy, not for medals or citations, but for the chance to shake a hand and whisper thanks. Spring 1944. The P-51 Mustang is finally where it was always meant to be, climbing to meet the bombers over Germany, fighting the Luftwaffe at the razor's edge of performance, and coming home. For months, American and British squadrons watched helplessly as Mustangs faltered at high altitude, engines flaming out before combat, forced to abandon bombers in the most perilous fights over Berlin, Leipzig, and Brunswick. But after Kennedy's field innovation, a baffle as simple as a kitchen fix, spread by necessity and desperation, the numbers begin to tell their own story. For the first time, engine-related mission aborts plummet. Squadron logs show a drop from 30% engine failures on critical altitude missions to less than 5%. Mustang groups start returning with bombers intact, pilots and planes undamaged by the sky itself. Every escort mission over Germany becomes a live demonstration of ingenuity versus doctrine. May 1st, 1944, the Great Raid on Berlin. Crowbar, Rid-Eye, and Lucky Lady lead the wave. Temperatures fall, contrails streak the air, Luftwaffe fighters swarm from the cloud banks, but the bombers are never unguarded. Every Mustang in Kennedy's group holds formation through the climb and through the fight. Commanders are incredulous. Lieutenant Graves gives a grinning report. We hit 30,000, mixed it with Focke-Wulf's, brought every bird back. Engine gauges were steady. Kennedy's trick worked even with holes in the radiator. The technical officers record their data. Kennedy collates hours of temperature readings, fuel flow statistics, range extension, and sorties flown. He cannot publish. Official policy forbids field hacks from entering the record, but his statistics no longer lie. Escort missions completed, up by 25%. Mustang operational readiness, highest in 8th Air Force history. Merlin engine coolant failures, nearly eliminated for the Kennedy-modified aircraft. The British, taking note, begin adapting similar hacks for their Rolls-Royce Merlin variants, whether Mustangs or Spitfires. Soviets executing high-altitude operations over Eastern Europe demand technical briefings. The legacy is spreading, given wings not by committee, but by the mechanics' hands on steel. The pilots take pride in the transformation. Kennedy gets letters from bomber crews, from Mustang groups across Europe. You kept us flying, you kept us alive. The myth of invincibility grows, not just in stories, but in survivors' accounts. The 8th Air Force increases sortie rates, confidence surging. Bomber losses drop, Luftwaffe defenses falter, and the Mustang's reputation grows even among its enemies. German pilots, once told to wait for engine failures, now face relentless escort at every altitude. But Kennedy's miracle remains urgent and humble. Each day brings new mechanical challenges, a frost-stressed radiator, battle damage, orders to remove unauthorized mods. Some are forced to strip Kennedy's baffles for inspection, only to reinstall them through whispered consensus. Out in the air, the P-51 Mustang leaves contrails over Berlin, Paris, Vienna. Now even the little friends, as bomber crews call their fighter escorts, have become symbols not just of dominance, but of field-driven survival. The hack has become invisible, a part of everyday battle, hidden in plain sight. The legacy is measured in lives. By the missions completed, the friends returned, the bombers saved. Kennedy, still tired and unsung, finds himself surrounded by gratitude and a new kind of respect, the hard-earned thanks only given to those who rewrite what survival means. But he knows the fight isn't just against enemy fighters or frozen altitudes. It's against forgetting, against letting ingenuity be lost to paperwork or pride. In simple, whispered words echoing at dawn, he tells his crew, keep them flying, keep them coming home. The Mustang, at last, is invincible at altitude, not because of its engine or its fame, but because Kennedy and his crew changed what was possible. One hack, one sortie, one saved life at a time. By summer's end, the skies over Europe had changed. In countless squadron debriefs, the numbers spoke for themselves. More bombers reached their targets, more Mustangs came home, more pilots lived to fight another day. Gus Kennedy, ever the maverick, continued working quietly, always focused on the next sortie, the next hack, the next risk his hands could minimize. Victory in Europe arrived, and with it, official histories were already being written. Technical papers from North American Aviation praised the field reliability of the Mustang, but did not mention the shop tent at RAF Debden or the nervous nights spent shaping homemade baffles by lantern light. The myth of the Mustang's invincibility at altitude grew, yet its roots, a mechanic's practical experiment, a squadron's stubborn faith, were left out of the official record. Some pilots wrote memoirs, crediting Kennedy's baffle for saving their lives. Others, scattered across new commands or post-war college classrooms, quietly passed on the practical lessons. Sometimes the critical fix is out in the field, not in a drafting room, but in the dirt, amid frozen fingers and makeshift solutions. Kennedy received no citations, no medals. He returned home with a battered toolbox, a sheaf of technical notes, and the gratitude of dozens who would never forget what it meant to fly at the edge and survive. He built engines for crop dusters and racers, always haunted by absent friends and proud of those who flew, just a little faster, a little higher, a little safer. Decades later, historians puzzled over the sudden spike in Mustang success during the spring of '44. They combed pilots' letters, maintenance logs, and field bulletins, all to find snapshots of innovation. flashes of field-driven brilliance erased by regulation, bureaucracy, and the quiet humility of veterans who carried the burden and blessing of survival. The real legacy was invisible, woven into every high-performance radiator thereafter, into technical manuals that now permitted field modifications, and into the memory of a war won not just in the sky, but on the ground, too. For Kennedy, for Crowbar, for Lucky Lady, the end was never the point. The fight was in the refusal, the unwillingness to let fear or paperwork dictate who lived and how. The baffle became a symbol, a story told in hangars and mess halls from England to Korea, always with a wink. Don't ask Kennedy for permission. Ask him for results. In the closing credits of history, the lesson remains unchanged. Innovation is a human story, a struggle against limits, a refusal to accept the inevitable. For every Mustang that roared above the clouds, for every pilot who looked down at a steady temperature gauge and saw life instead of death, the revolution was real, and it was built by hands, not headlines. Because sometimes the greatest victory is the one that goes unseen but is felt in every survivor's breath, every engine's song, every dawn that breaks without loss. So remember Gus Kennedy, mechanic, maverick, innovator, and the Mustang that for one war-torn season became invincible, because he broke the rules and believed. Subscribe, reflect. Tell these stories, because history is only alive when we remember those who bent it for the better.